In the summer of 1900, in an orphanage in Indianapolis, 3 infants died within weeks of each other. The cause, once it was finally identified, turned out to be something that was in their milk, something that had been put there deliberately, not by a criminal, but the dairy that supplied it. The compound was formaldehyde. The same chemical that morticians use to preserve the dead had been poured into the milk to keep it from spoiling. And it was completely legal. An investigation that followed would link at least 30 more children's deaths in the preceding 2 years to the same practice. The state's public health official, John Newell Hurdy, would eventually connect more than 400 deaths of young children across Indiana to the combination of formaldehyde, bacteria, and filth in the milk supply. But Indianapolis was not an exception. It was a sample. Across the United States in the final decades of the 19th century, the food supply had become something that no modern consumer would recognize, and no modern law had yet been written to control it. This is the story of how long it took to change that, and of the man who volunteered to eat the evidence. To understand why formaldehyde ended up in a baby's bottle, you have to understand what food looked like in America before anyone was watching. The late 19th century was an era of industrial ambition and almost no industrial regulation. Factories were producing food at a scale the country had never seen, but there was no refrigeration, no standardized labeling, no federal law requiring manufacturers to list what they put into their products, or to prove that any of it was safe. Milk was among the worst offenders. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled quickly, sometimes within hours of leaving the cow. Dairies responded not by improving hygiene, but by disguising the decay. They diluted milk with water to stretch their supply, sometimes as much as half and half, then recolored the resulting bluish liquid with chalk or plaster dust to make it look white again. Some producers created the appearance of rich cream by floating a layer of pureed calf brains on the surface. When the milk began to sour despite all of this, they reached for chemistry, borax, salicylic acid, and increasingly formaldehyde, a compound that could keep milk looking and tasting fresh for up to 10 days. The process was efficient, inexpensive, and invisible to the consumer. A mother buying milk for her children had no way to know what had been added. The bottle looked the same. The milk tasted the same, perhaps even slightly sweeter thanks to formaldehyde's faintly sweet flavor. The formaldehyde was sold under brand names designed to sound harmless: Preservaline, Iceline. The labels promised freshness and purity. If they did not mention what the active ingredient was, chemical companies marketed these products directly to dairies as modern, scientific solutions to the ancient problem of spoilage. Some advertisements even claimed that preservatives were beneficial, that they made the milk cleaner and safer. The opposite was true, but in an era without mandatory testing or disclosure, no one had the authority to say so. Milk wasn't the only product being altered. Butter was routinely mixed with borax to extend its shelf life and colored with lead to improve its appearance. Coffee was often a mixture of sawdust, ground beets, and charred grains, dyed black to resemble the real thing. Canned vegetables were tinted with copper sulfate to make them look greener. Honey was stretched with glucose syrup. Spices were bulked with ground shells and dirt. And none of it, not a single ingredient, not a single additive, not a single substitution, was required to appear on a label, because no label was required at all. Medical historians later described this period as the century of the Great American Stomachache, but the phrase understates it. People weren't just uncomfortable. In the documented cases where records survived, they were being harmed in ways they couldn't trace and couldn't prevent, because they had no way of knowing what they were eating. If you've been watching this channel, you know this is where the story turns. Someone always sees what's happening. Someone always decides to prove it. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because every episode on this channel ends the same way, with the law catching up to the truth. And here's a question for the comments. Have you ever turned a product around and actually read the ingredient list on the back? After this story, you might look at it differently. The man who decided to prove it was Harvey Washington Wiley, a tall, broad-shouldered chemist from Indiana who had been appointed chief chemist of the United States Department of Agriculture in 1883. Wiley's original assignment had nothing to do with food safety. He'd been hired to develop alternatives to sugarcane, but within months of arriving in Washington, he began noticing something that disturbed him far more than sugar policy: the scale and brazenness of food adulteration across the country. He started investigating quietly, analyzing samples of common foods, butter, honey, milk, spices, canned goods, and cataloging what he found inside them. Between 1887 and 1902, his Bureau of Chemistry published a 10-part study titled Foods and Food Adulterants. The findings were methodical, exhaustive, and damning. Product after product contained undisclosed chemicals, preservatives that had never been tested for safety, dyes made from compounds that were also used in industrial manufacturing, substitution so thorough that some products contained almost none of the ingredient their label claimed. But Wiley had a problem. He could prove that these chemicals were in the food. He could not yet prove that they harmed the people who ate them. And without that proof, no law would pass. Industry lobbyists had made sure of it. Since 1879, nearly 100 bills had been introduced in Congress to regulate the safety of food and drugs. The industry had defeated every single one, so Wiley devised an experiment that would become one of the most unusual and most consequential in American scientific history. In 1902, he convinced Congress to allocate $5,000 for what he formerly called the hygienic table trials. He set up a kitchen and dining room in the basement of the Bureau of Chemistry's office in Washington. He installed a chef. And he recruited 12 young government employees, vigorous and voracious, as one account described them, to serve as test subjects. They would receive 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, prepared by the Bureau's kitchen. The meals were real food, well cooked and generously portioned. The catch was what came with them. Half the volunteers ate only the meals. The other half received the same meals plus carefully measured doses of a single chemical additive, one of the preservatives then in wide commercial use. The experiment would test one additive at a time, starting at low doses and gradually increasing until the subjects showed symptoms. Before and after every meal, the men were weighed, their temperatures and pulse rates recorded, their urine and stool samples collected and analyzed. Every change was documented. Wiley called it a scientific trial. The Washington Post, covering the story with a mixture of fascination and horror, gave it a different name. They called the volunteers the Poison Squad. The nickname caught fire. Newspapers across the country began running updates on the experiment as if it were a sporting event, who was sick, who had dropped out, what the men had eaten that day. A song was written about them. Editorial cartoonists drew the 12 young men at their table, napkins tucked into their collars, calmly consuming capsules of industrial chemicals beside plates of roast turkey. The slogan that someone pinned to the dining room wall became the squad's unofficial motto, "None but the brave can eat the fare." The celebrity was useful to Wiley. Every headline about the Poison Squad was a headline the food industry couldn't suppress. The experiment was happening in plain sight in the basement of a government building, and the entire country was watching. The first additive tested was borax, the most widely used food preservative of the era, found in meat, butter, and dairy products across the country. Wiley chose it deliberately. Borax had been studied enough that the risks to his volunteers were manageable, but it was common enough that a negative result would have national implications. The borax was initially mixed into the food itself, hidden in the butter and the milk, but the volunteers quickly identified which dishes tasted different and began avoiding them. Wiley adjusted the procedure. The additive was now delivered in capsules, and the men were watched carefully to ensure they swallowed their dose. The results were unambiguous. Within weeks, the borax group developed persistent headaches, severe stomach pain, and a loss of appetite so complete that some men struggled to finish meals they had previously enjoyed. Wiley's report concluded that the subjects had been rendered unfit for work of any kind. The Christmas menu of 1902 became notorious. Newspapers reprinted it with dark humor, listing each course followed by the word borax, applesauce, borax, turkey, borax, rice pudding, borax. By the summer of 1903, the volunteers had had enough. They went on strike, refusing, as one newspaper put it, to take any more borax, especially in the sweltering Washington heat. Wiley negotiated a compromise. 7 men agreed to continue until late June, and the borax trial was ended early. The data, however, was already conclusive. Wiley earned a new nickname of his own from the press, Old Borax. Then came salicylic acid, a compound used in canned goods and beverages. In 1905, the Poison Squad's salicylic acid trial produced something worse than discomfort. Evidence documented in Wiley's notes that the compound had caused bleeding in the lining of the stomach. And then came formaldehyde, the same preservative that had been linked to the deaths of children in Indianapolis, the same compound that funeral parlors used to embalm the dead. Wiley administered it to his volunteers. The formaldehyde trial had to be ended prematurely. The men became too sick to continue. If you're still here, hit subscribe, because the fight that came next almost didn't succeed. And here's a question worth answering in the comments. What's the strangest ingredient you've ever found listed on a food product? The Poison Squad's results gave Wiley what he had lacked for 20 years, evidence that common food preservatives caused measurable harm to healthy adults. If these chemicals made strong young men sick within weeks, the implications for children, the elderly, and anyone with a compromised constitution were obvious. though Wiley was careful to let the data speak for itself. But evidence, it turned out, was not enough. The food industry mobilized against Wiley with a ferocity that surprised even seasoned Washington observers. Manufacturers argued that preservatives were essential to the food supply and that without them, food would spoil before reaching the consumer. Prices would rise beyond what ordinary families could afford, and the poor would suffer most. The argument had a surface logic that made it effective in congressional hearings. Industry-funded scientists published counter-studies disputing Wiley's findings. They questioned his methodology, his sample sizes, the relevance of results obtained from healthy young men to the general population. Some argued that small doses of preservatives were harmless, that the poison, as always, was in the dose. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill in numbers that the nascent consumer protection movement could not match. The food and drug industries had money, organization, and decades of practice in defeating regulation. Some manufacturers went further than economic arguments. They framed the debate in terms of liberty itself, arguing publicly that it was their right as Americans to add whatever they wished to their products, and that government interference in the contents of food was an attack on free enterprise. One industry-aligned chemist wrote a formal defense of food preservatives that argued, in essence, that regulating additives was a violation of constitutional freedom. The argument sounds absurd today. In the early 1900s, it was persuasive enough to kill bill after bill, and the bills kept dying. Year after year, the evidence accumulated from Wiley's laboratory, from state health officials, from the documented deaths of children, and year after year, Congress refused to act. The industry's position was not that the evidence was wrong. It was that the evidence didn't matter enough to justify the cost of regulation. The turning point came not from a laboratory, but from a novel. In January 1906, a young writer named Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle. Sinclair had spent 7 weeks undercover in the meat-packing plants of Chicago, and his novel, though fictional in its characters, described in visceral detail the conditions he had witnessed. The filth, the rot, the casual mixing of diseased meat and chemical preservatives into products sold to ordinary American families. Sinclair had intended the book as an argument for socialism, a portrait of immigrant workers crushed by industrial capitalism. Instead, the public seized on something he hadn't expected, the food. Years later, Sinclair would write ruefully that he had aimed for the public's heart and hit it in the stomach. The Jungle sold 1 million copies in its first year. President Theodore Roosevelt read it. He did not particularly like Sinclair. He once dismissed him as a crackpot because of his socialist politics. But the descriptions of the meatpacking plants troubled him deeply. Roosevelt had reason to be skeptical of official reassurances. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, soldiers had been fed canned meat so contaminated that the scandal became known as the embalmed beef affair. The president ordered his own secret investigation, bypassing the USDA entirely, and sending Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social worker James B. Reynolds into the Chicago stockyards. Their report confirmed what Sinclair had written. The USDA's initial dismissal, Roosevelt now believed, had been influenced by the very industry the department was supposed to oversee. At the same time, journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams was publishing a series in Collier's magazine titled The Great American Fraud, exposing the patent medicine industry, the unregulated market of cure-all tonics and elixirs that contained everything from alcohol to opium, sold without any requirement to disclose their contents. The pressure converged. Public outrage over the Jungle, Adams' exposés, Wiley's years of accumulated data, the documented deaths of children from formaldehyde-laced milk, the poison squad's evidence that preservatives harmed healthy adults. For the first time, the political cost of inaction exceeded the political cost of confronting the industry. On June 30th, 1906, President Roosevelt signed 2 laws on the same day. The first was the Meat Inspection Act, which mandated federal inspection of all meat sold in interstate commerce. The second was the Pure Food and Drug Act, also known as the Wiley Act, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated or misbranded foods and drugs across state lines. The law's language was direct. For the first time in American history, it was illegal to put an undisclosed chemical into food and sell it to the public. Manufacturers were required to list the active ingredients in their products. Additives had to be identified. Adulterated food, defined as any product containing substances that made it injurious to health, could be seized by federal authorities. Misbranding, claiming a product contained something it didn't, or omitting an ingredient the consumer had a right to know about, became a federal offense, punishable by fine and imprisonment. Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry, the small division of the USDA where the poison squad had eaten its borax-laced Christmas dinners, He was given enforcement authority. It would evolve over the following decades into what is now the Food and Drug Administration. The law did not arrive quickly. 23 years had passed since Wiley first took his post at the USDA. Nearly 100 legislative attempts had failed before this one succeeded. The industry had fought it at every stage, in committee rooms, in editorial pages, in the quiet corridors where lobbyists met legislators. But on that June afternoon in 1906, the signature was made, and the landscape of American food changed permanently. Formaldehyde disappeared from the milk supply. Borax was removed from butter and meat. Salicylic acid was taken out of canned goods. Copper sulfate was no longer used to color vegetables. The era of invisible chemistry in food, of compounds added without disclosure, without testing, without consequence, was formally, legally, and irreversibly over. Harvey Washington Wiley would later be called the father of the Pure Food and Drug Act. He had spent more than 2 decades building the case, conducting the experiments, enduring the political defeats, and refusing to stop. The 12 men of the Poison Squad, the young clerks who had eaten borax with their Christmas dinner and swallowed formaldehyde capsules in the basement of a government building, had provided the proof that made the law possible. The orphanage in Indianapolis, where 3 infants died in the summer of 1900, is not a museum. There is no plaque on the wall, no monument in the yard. The children's names and most surviving records have not been preserved. What happened to them was not considered remarkable at the time. It was considered normal. That was the problem. Death from contaminated food was so common that it barely registered as news. But what survives is the system their deaths helped create. The slow, stubborn, 23-year accumulation of evidence and outrage that finally produced a law. The next time you pick up a carton of milks, any brand, any store, anywhere, turn it around. Look at the ingredient list. Look at the expiration date stamped on the side. Look at the small print that tells you precisely what is inside and when it was packaged. That information exists because for decades, it didn't. The industry called their additives harmless. They sold formaldehyde under cheerful brand names and told mothers it kept the milk fresh. They fought for 23 years to keep the law from passing. The label doesn't announce itself. It doesn't claim to be important. It simply tells the truth, in small print, on the side of every carton, because a chemist in a basement kitchen once decided to eat what the industry was selling, measure what it did to the human body, and refused to stop until someone listened.